Hello and welcome to another week of the War Report. We are back with a whole new week of news. Now it hasn't been quite a week; it's only been like 6 days. But let technicalities aside, our first major story is that Iran has discovered a massive oil field that can boost its national reserves by 33%. So it's poised to become the second largest oil field in Iran, based on what Iranian media is telling us. It supposedly has over 50 billion barrels. I think they said 55 billion total, and that the Iranian leadership, the Iranian media was coming out saying, this is a major victory for Iran. Look at this, White House. It doesn't matter how much sanctions you put on us. It doesn't matter what kind of punitive measure you take on us. We'll just produce more oil because we just found more oil. Now, I think, of course, it's playing it up. Now, in the report that Rouhani said when he gave his official announcement, he said 53 billion. And I've seen as high as 55 billion. So pretty much between the 50 and 55 billion range, what we're looking at, which is nothing to nothing to scoff at. But this is in Khuzestan, which for those of you who know your history about the Iran-Iraq War, you'll know that, of course, is the Arab Sunni region in Iran, and now, granted, during the war, of course, they sided actually with the Iranian government. Now, I wouldn't be surprised if we saw just all of a sudden Khuzestani separatists rising up. Now, uh, you know, I think we all know how these things work.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting. I mean, what they're saying basically is, it, 55 is not like exactly like once you factor in cost of delivery or cost of extraction, it's more like 15. However, it's still very significant. It's going to be one of the biggest fields. Um, I would guess, if anything, this could put Iran in a bind in the sense that Iran has normally said that one of the reasons for uh, going with nuclear energy is to supply power to the country, essentially, right? To heat homes and what have you, and that's going to be a little bit more difficult to justify now. Of course, Iran shouldn't have to justify it, but that's not the world that we live in.
Well,
I'm going to presume that China is very happy about this, that Saudi Arabia is very concerned about this. Um, I don't know. I mean, I cannot see that Iran is going to sit on this. And we should probably expect European oil manufacturers to begin persuading and making deals with Iran probably within the next year.
yeah, and that actually segues into something I was going to say, but you brought up a point I wanted to address. Now, of course, Iran's justification, actually pre-deal and a little bit into the deal before Trump threw it out the window, was our nuclear program is for energy, it's for heat, it's for completely civilian use. Now, this is coupled with, of course, Iran backing out of its commitments of the deal after the past year and a half of, I would say, butting heads between the U.S. and Iran. I think what has happened is, okay, if they were going to build a bomb, they would have it already. They would have had it 25 years ago. We've been over this. I think it's their nuclear program. I think their has become more of a bluff than anything, like saying we can make a nuclear bomb whenever we want to. I think again, it's become a bluff, a bargaining chip, something they can use to negotiate specifically with the Western powers, to a lesser extent the East. But um, beyond that, I wouldn't be surprised if we see an actual summit between Macron and the Iranian leadership in the coming years. Now, I know
Mm-hmm.
Iran, I believe they have an election in 2021, so about a year and a half from now. But I wouldn't be surprised if we saw more overtures, more making of diplomatic inroads between European Union states, again, specifically France, and Iran, similar to how we had the Japanese meet with the Iranians back in the summer.
Yeah, I would expect so. If today, I don't want to wander off topic too much, but um, if today is any indication with regards to uh, with Erdogan visiting uh, the U.S., then I don't see why he wouldn't why there wouldn't be Macron courting Iran, because obviously Erdogan is not going to change his mind in the S-400. Um, doesn't seem to be all that upset about the F-35 project that they sunk hundreds of millions of dollars into. The talk is mostly around optics with regards to the Armenian genocide and so on, and really both countries are in a process of right now uh, optimizing what their optics look like outwardly, for the international stage as well as the domestic. So yeah, you know like I think all of this is going to depend more on Macron than Iran, of course. So would Macron do that? Yeah, hell he would. I mean, just take a look last week. The Nord Stream 2 is nearly done. Denmark and Norway have signed on. It's like I don't hear any rumblings. Doesn't mean it won't happen, but I don't hear any rumblings of sanctions against more EU countries from the US. So I would expect Macron to go for it.
Yeah, I definitely would, and especially I would say, okay, Japan isn't exactly a Western country in the traditional sense, but for all intents and purposes, it's a Western aligned country. It's part of the
Yeah.
American-led order, at least in a sense. I could see that changing in the coming years with the rearmament, but again, that's just getting into semantics. I think now that the Japanese, that Abe, have opened that floodgate, more Western leaders will be less hesitant to meet with the Iranians or traditional American enemies.
Yeah, I mean we've been watching this for quite some time now. I mean that's one of the ironic things about Trump is like I think when it's all said and done, all this nonsense about RussiaGate and um, the latest impeachment thing with Ukraine and Zelensky, I that one goes more to the heart. But I would say the WikiLeaks and Assange and everything that precluded the election, I would say that's it's not irrelevant, but it's window dressing. I think what they're afraid of is that Trump's election announced an instability within the U.S. Like just the fact that he got into office was a green light for a lot of these countries that wouldn't have done that during Obama's tenure. And libs and Dems are right when they say that that he has undermined them. Like he hasn't undermined their democratic process. What he's undermined is their strategic geopolitical power.
Yeah, he's underlined the
And their
neoliberal
leadership.
empire. Uh,
Yes.
as
Yeah,
unwitting,
that's what he's done.
yeah, as unwitting as it's been. Now, admittedly, he's been more overt about wanting to be less interventionist, and he has somewhat lived up to that. Some things in Syria and Yemen aside, he, I would say, mostly unwittingly, because I don't think he has any intentions of undoing the American-led world order, rather remaking it. But in his attempts to remake it and all the pushback he's gotten, so funny enough, the Democrats, never Trumpers, play just as much as a part in the downfall of the empire by presenting such a resistance, to borrow their word, that
Mm-hmm.
it's made it worse rather than trying to negotiate with Trump and said, okay, we'll cede ground here and here and here. America doesn't necessarily have to do all of this. We can still do some of this. So if there would have been an initial cooperation with Trump, the empire would have actually been in a much better place. And you can argue that I lamented this about a year ago, that people like Michael Flynn being removed, people very pro-Trump people being removed from the White House, really screwed his administration. But in terms of undoing the American empire, if they would have made peace with the administration and tried to work with the administration, at least to some degree, America would probably be in a lot better place on the world stage, at least in terms of the neoliberal empire.
Right. I mean, this is a huge embarrassment. One of the things that the Dems go on about is that he's an embarrassment. I mean, okay, he's an oaf. We get it. He's an embarrassment, but you've exacerbated it. Your resistance to him. And I mean, I get it. They want the world to know that they are not aligned with him. That they can't wait to have somebody else in office. But it takes 4 years minimum. And frankly, the impeachment and the fake dossiers with RussiaGate and all of this stuff, um, and that none of it panning out, like that also had a compound effect on Europe as well, and its neoliberal order. It showed like a total lack of confidence, and ironically, you have Merkel being very ill and definitely receding from any kind of notion of leadership of the EU at the moment. And Macron has come in, and Macron is basically doing all kinds of stuff, such as going on a right wing blog for an interview, like a lot of things that you wouldn't have expected.
Yeah, that
So
being the wild card, the unconventional moves.
yeah,
Now, I also do
so,
want to say, just
yeah, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
in closing on this, people bring up, and including the show, that Trump has 40% of the planet under sanctions, whether that be because of deals with Russia, arms sales, any various thing. Now, admittedly, yeah, it is a lot. It's been excessive. It's increased under Trump even more than Obama, which is impressive just from a completely disconnected view of the fact that that could even happen in the first place. But
Mhm.
I'll ask you to imagine something. I'd hate to do this because I get frustrated when people do this. Imagine how much higher that 40% would be if Hillary was president. Now, hear me out. You would think Hillary, okay, should be good for the stability of the empire, admittedly. But there would be countries that were aching to move, especially if she did start a blunderous war in Iran or Syria. So you look at this like, I mean, what if Abe wanted to meet with Japan in the summer of 2019 and we had President Hillary Clinton in office? She wouldn't be happy about that. Now, granted, the Iran deal would probably fare a little bit better, but I still don't think she would be happy about that. What if we had any of these various European states cozying up towards Russia? Because I mean, look, Trump has, for better or for worse, done a lot of things for European populism. I mean, I don't think it would have not happened without him. I mean, for example, we had Orban there before Trump was even in office. But when you had countries like Hungary, like Italy, like Turkey cozying up to Russia, the response would have been much harsher from the United States had an establishment candidate been in office.
I think that's a great point. Well, I think we should continue imagining what the country might have been like with her. Not that we're with her, if she had been in office, because it's for one, it's going to be very relevant. As because I mean, this show is basically forecasting kind of a decline or a major shift taking place within the world order, within the American order. Yeah, I would agree with you that she would have been much more harsh. I don't know how she would have reacted, how other countries like France and Germany would have reacted if she wanted to instigate a no-fly zone in Syria. I would predict that several countries, including Turkey, might have been gung ho for it. They might have been quite excited by it, right? But at what cost? And who would have opted out? And it, we can speculate, but and we should, but I don't know which countries would. I mean, I can imagine Britain would have gone for it, but it would have been a very different world.
I
And
mean, hell, what do you
yeah, we
think? What
shouldn't.
I mean, 2018 was a slew of European elections. What do you think a lot of these would have looked like had there been a United States war ongoing in Syria with even more refugees than before flowing out of the country? You think Leg and Nord would have only gotten about 30%? They would have gotten like 50, 55%. Now, I know I exaggerate, but these right-wing populist parties, they would have skyrocketed, ironically enough, had Hillary Clinton become the president of the United States and waged war on Iran or Syria.
Yeah, I mean, people have speculated that they have speculated that that a Hillary victory might have increased the rise of the right wing. I don't know. I'm not I'm not so sure. I'm sincere about that. I cannot make up my mind about that.
Well, I mean, it's worth considering that, of course, the pro-U.S. propaganda, a lot of the American Empire neoliberal propaganda, for example, the Radio Free Hungary would have been instituted a lot sooner in a lot more
Oh, for
European
sure.
countries. Yes.
Right, right. I was thinking more at home. I was thinking more at home, like what would happen in the U.S. if Hillary had won. But yeah, you're right. There might have been a very strong reaction. I think in some ways both of them, both Trump and Hillary, acted as a catalyst. Uh, for different reasons.
Oh yeah, I would definitely say so. Hillary would have been the extreme where the Empire really overplays its hand. It really gets in all the last moves they want to because they know that at a critical juncture need to do everything they can to maintain the Empire. Whereas you have somebody like Trump who's like, okay, what's the point of 95% of this? Let's scale back. And then, of course, the massive backlash, which led to the situation we had today. But unless you have any more comments on that, this I would say segues right into it. We have some Syria news.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so one of the main things out of Syria was a U.S. drone allegedly picked up Turkish war crimes being committed in northeastern Syria against Kurdish groups, against the SDF. Now, I'm I'm not going to pretend like Turkey is the most moral country in the world. I'm not going to pretend like they would fight a good, clean war. But looking beyond that, we all know what they're trying to do. We all know where this is going.
Right. This is their way of trying to hem in Turkey. Like, it's not because they give a shit about the Kurds. It's because they feel that Turkey has gone too far outside the box, and frankly, it's making not only Turkey's relationship with America seem dubious, but with NATO and Europe as well. What the hell is exactly going on? Uh, so I'm assuming that they're going to uh, use this as leverage. But again, Erdogan does not seem to be all that perturbed. He does not look like a man afraid of the situation. He looks concerned, but he does not look overwhelmed.
Oh no, a much lesser men would have been again either kissing the American ring, fleeing the country, or completely bowing to the Russians. None of which Erdogan has done. Uh,
Yeah.
to his credit as a sort of wild card leader, I can respect him at the very least for that. But we can all I can safely say, and I'm pretty sure most of not all of you can safely say, the reason this report comes out now, this is actually from Southfront, but of course, Southfront reports on a lot of what the mainstream media reports and actually reports on the narratives. I would definitely recommend giving them a good checking them out because we actually get a lot of information for the show here. So
Mhm.
credit to whoever runs them. But the point being is the Turkey Kurdish narrative has fallen out of the mainstream. Nobody cares about it anymore. It's no longer the beginning of October. It's the middle of November. People don't care that Turkey is bombing the Kurds, that Turkey is invading northern Syria, and we have to save the SDF and the moderate democratic forces we supported against these other moderate democratic forces, which defected and joined Turkey and then became terrorists. It's to try to reinvigorate the outrage that quickly dissipated.
It- yeah. It's amazing just what a few weeks has done. You don't hear anything about the Kurds. And, Western liberals basically made the Kurds about themselves. The Kurds' suffering was their suffering while they, have a pumpkin spice latte.
We're all
Um,
the Kurds, I tweet at the
we're all
Starbucks.
Kurds today. Worst president ever. Um, yeah, so, you know, yeah, that's fallen out. It's nobody cares anymore.
Yeah,
Um,
ever since the SDF actually sat down with Damascus and representatives from the Syrian government. Now, granted, those negotiations haven't exactly been fruitful or very warm, but nonetheless, they're happening. as soon as that happened, as soon as they realized that destroyed their narrative, people forgot about it until the news about the U.S. securing the oil fields in northeastern Syria came about. There wasn't much news about Syria until now, and this isn't even the biggest story out of Syria this week. But I think it's worth covering because the media is really going to try to drum up the Kurds. We must protect them, and of course try to get all the usual suspects. Of course, the Democratic nominees, the political establishment in Washington, crying about the Kurds again. Now, in bigger news, but still not the biggest news, is Russia and Syria have increased shelling of Idlib, and I dare say we predicted this. We said that as things died down in northeastern Syria, as the U.S. not
Yeah.
necessarily withdrew, but lessened its commitment to Syria, we would see more action in Idlib. And as you can tell on the map, there's been a lot of back and forth with the red and green between uh, opposition forces and pro-government forces, whether that be the Assad government proper, whether that be Russian forces, pro-government militias, etc. But it's also interesting, of course, as now the spotlight's on Turkey again, or at least they're trying to point the spotlight on Turkey again. Uh,
Hmm.
it's more of a free hand for Russia and Syria to do whatever they want in Idlib, and again, as we've been saying, it becomes a bargaining chip. Uh, the Russians and the Syrians can get Turkey to cede on Idlib if they're willing to make a deal, at least partially, on northern Syria.
Yes. You know, the and I've also noticed that the West isn't as obsessed with what's happening to Idlib. I mean, I'm seeing more and more stories about how we lost, why we lost, which is in itself is quite incredible. What we got wrong in Syria. I spoke a little bit about this last week with bringing up that article from the Guardian, where they, basically what it was information that I realize RT is a semi-government funded outfit, but lots of people besides them in 2015 were already saying that you know these jihadists. There's not very many of them. In fact, I still remember Lindsey Graham asking in the House, like, "How many do you have?" And it was like 500, not 5,000, which is ridiculous. So yeah, Russia. I mean, I think Russia going in and cleaning up in Idlib is the only way that this war is going to end.
Oh yeah, I mean,
Uh,
maybe I exaggerate, but once Idlib is taken care of, northeastern Syria can be completely solved with a political solution. Again, we're already seeing the groundwork for that. Now, as how long that takes is anyone's guess. But point being is, as soon as the radical elements, the radical Islamic elements in Idlib are taken care of, and it looks like as time goes on, that becomes more and more the case. I mean, just look at how much ground has been ceded in northwestern Syria since the beginning of the year.
mhm,
Once you get
mhm.
that, the Kurds, again, say what you will about them, at least the leadership is semi reasonable. They're willing to negotiate, make a deal. You can have that. And the war in Syria, again, it's all but over, but this will formally put an end to hostilities, which we'll get into another story I want to get into. But I do think it's funny you bring up the Guardian and the left wing media's, oh, how we lost in Syria. Where did we go wrong? Because you'll notice a lot of those pieces have come out in the past month, but they're predicated on we failed the Syrian people. Now let's help the Kurdish people.
Right, right, right. That's a very good point. I mean, they're never going to shift their focus. After all, we're talking about huge tectonic shifts happening, right? Um, I don't expect them to. People are, writers are going to be as creative as possible to both conceal what is happening and make just about everything, frame everything within a kind of liberal moral outlook. Um, so yeah, uh, but I don't even see all that much being written about the Kurds right now. Much more so last week than this week. Um, yeah, I mean, I think it's over. You know, take for instance, um, Trump's timing with Bolton. I mean, he fires Bolton the day after the infamous phone call to Zelensky. Um, some have argued also it was because Bolton wanted to go to war with Iran. All
Yep.
of these things are, definitely getting in the way. They're getting in the way with where things should have been progressing. It should be noted, just to come back to the points we were making earlier about Hillary, that Hillary's camp, it has to be mentioned, did not want war with Iran. They had a completely different strategy about how to maintain American hegemony, and I dare say that they had a better approach with Iran.
Yeah, that
And
they had the pacification thing. Like we're gonna mend ties. We're gonna bring them into our world order and slowly but surely, pretty much economically colonize them. Which that's what the
right.
that's what the Iran deal was, and that's actually what a lot of the hardliners in Iran opposed about, is that this is just a door for soft conquest from the West.
Yes, yes. No, that's absolutely true. Um, so this and this was a very radical shift. I think maybe in hindsight, of all of there's two radical shifts that I think you can point to geopolitically with regards to America in the Trump administration, and that is the policy on Syria, what happened in Syria, and what happened in Iran. And in both cases, it's not the outcome that anybody wanted. Syria was supposed to get pummeled. Iran was to become supine. So, and that didn't happen. And I can see the logic of it. Technically, it made more sense for Iran, who has a very low birth rate, a very kind of, let's say it's, I mean, I'm not saying Iran isn't a European country. It's not a Western country, certainly, right? But you could make arguments that, there is a disconnect on some level between the rulers and the youth. I think basically what American intelligence was suggesting was a soft takeover. That would be perfect. And the hard nut was Syria, but it wasn't that hard. All you had to do was maybe start a fire somewhere else that Russia had to attend to, let's say in the Baltics, and maybe Syria is yours, or promise something to Turkey vis-a-vis the EU with Merkel. So I think all those strategies got thrown away, and now there's a kind of improvisation. I think the options that Trump's team presented are more difficult to manifest, to catalyze. But let's not also forget this. Maybe there's less wisdom in them too. It might make Netanyahu happy to know that Iran is being crushed, right? But if I was Israel, I wouldn't go about it that way, because it's only strengthened Iran. So anyhow, I just wanted to throw that in.
Yeah, that is funny. Just number one, touch on a couple of your points. Bolton's firing has really done a lot to shut Pompeo up. I think it really sent a message to him that's saying, fall in line. You'll notice that you haven't heard a peep out of him since
Yeah.
2 months. Point
Yeah.
number two is Netanyahu, of course, him, the Likud's party, fervent opposition to the Iran deal. That really reflected, of course, that it led to Obama being called anti-Israel, anti-Semitic, all the usual things. It's funny, Obama's opposition to Israel was as far as opposition to Netanyahu. You can tell, actually, he had American involvement in the 2015 Israeli elections, tried to get the center-right coalition in power because they would be more cooperative with, again, someone like an Obama. But yeah, it is funny that out of all of this, the end result is Iran is in the best position it's been since before the revolution.
Absolutely. I think also this is one of the divisions that you have with, with, say, American liberals and, say, liberals in Israel. You could make the argument that uh, the soft power approach, with a bit of application of hard power when it's necessary, that Obama utilized was the better approach uh, long term. And that in itself might have been an indication of a kind of a weakness to administer hard power. Because Trump's ascendancy also marks um, a kind of weakness underneath. The reluctance to send troops into Syria, the fact that people often talk about how all they had to do was rely on Al Qaeda and a few other jihadists in order to topple Gaddafi. But those aren't necessarily good optics. They don't make for a good narrative in a ever fractioning EU. But that is the approach that they applied, and maybe it was the only sort of sensible approach they could do, because it looked like the hard approach was becoming more and more difficult to accomplish.
Well, I think what happened, and I say this semi-tongue-in-cheek, is Obama talked to Brzezinski once and thought it was a one-size-fits-all strategy.
Right, right. They were going to occupy Russia with Crimea and whatnot, but then, lo and behold, the 25 years that Soros dumped money into Ukrainian schools, including Crimea, for the Ukrainian language, and so on, all that investment went up, did nothing. The people overwhelmingly voted to return back to Russia, and that was that. That was much more so than the farmland. That's what they wanted.
Yeah, definitely. Now, one last piece of news on Syria, this is probably the most significant, is the founder of the infamous White Helmets and former MI6 agent James Le Mesurier has been found dead in Turkey after heavy drug use, and of course the mainstream media immediately accused Russia, saying they killed this humanitarian worker who was only assisting the poor Syrian people in the Syrian resistance against, of course, the evil Assad regime. So the Russian intelligence, the KGB, had to come in and kill him. Now,
Ivan threw him out of the window. Russia sent one of their Ivans.
Of course, with the vial of polonium, because that's standard operating procedure within Russian intelligence, as we all know.
Yeah, this guy didn't have a habit, right? Like he didn't OD or like become so inebriated that he fell out of his window in front of his house and was discovered at 4:30 in the morning. Like, no, it can't be that, right? But I can empathize with people who, after Khashoggi, might think that there's something more mysterious going on. It is incredible that it's happened. I've seen Western sources deny that he was ever an MI6.
Yeah, it's been quite the thing. Now, despite the fact that the official narrative, which they're giving us, is that he's just some drug you fell out his window, is highly believable. I must insert my own theories. I must put on my tinfoil hat. And
Okay.
I've heard theories, which I wouldn't say I subscribe to, but are definitely more reasonable than the Russia one, that the MI6 was tying up loose ends.
Hmm. Hmm. I mean, it's a hell of a loose end to tie up. It's very bad optics, don't you think?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
I mean,
But
it's possible.
I mean, with the admission of the loss of the war in Syria, I could see why they might want this guy to disappear, to shut up.
Right. And Britain just accepted over 100 white helmets and their families this week.
I did not hear about that though.
Yeah. So maybe there's a tie-in, or maybe the guy became depressed with the way the war went. It wouldn't be the first time that something like that has happened. That defeat ruins a man.
Yeah, but in this case, despite my speculations, I'm inclined to believe the narrative that he was some drug you fell out his window.
Mm.
Now, one last piece of news in Syria that I think will take us very cleanly into our next story is Syria has been bombed by
Israel.
Israel. You ruined my drum roll, but whatever. uh, it's not,
Sorry.
not like it was too impressive anyway. But they were bombed. More specifically, a militant group in Syria was bombed by Israel, and this particular militant group was the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. Now, they claimed that they were trying to assassinate one of the commanders. On the ground, Syrian reports say 2 civilians were killed and 10 were wounded by this attack. 3 missiles were shot. One was intercepted by Syrian air defenses. One hit his target, and simultaneously during this attack, they bombed Gaza, claiming to kill one of the other second in commands, one of the lieutenants of this organization. Now, when I first heard this, just based on the name, I was shocked because I figured Palestinian Islamic Jihad was one of these Muslim Brotherhood aligned groups that was Sunni Islamic that had cells fighting against the Assad government in Syria. Then I find out that the Palestinian Islamic Jihad is a pro Iran, pro Syria Shia Muslim group. Now, I find this shocking for two reasons. Number one, I didn't know there were actually enough Shia Muslims in Palestine to form a militant group, let alone have enough to have cells to fight in a foreign civil war. Number two, again, the fact that they were just Shia Muslim in general and that they were pro Assad. And we all know that the Palestinian movement has actually been split by the Syrian war. You had groups like the PLO, the more secular groups, the fighting on the pro-Assad side, where you had the more Islamist groups, the more the Muslim Brotherhood groups, of course, fighting on the rebel side, whether that be Hamas and any of these other various groups. Now, what I find shocking about this is Syria claims we need to bomb this Palestinian Islamic Jihad commander for national security, yet there are several pro-Palestinian groups, namely Hamas, fighting in Syria, of course, fighting against the Assad government, that have been untouched by Israeli strikes.
Yeah, I mean, I was surprised as well. I had no idea, and the formation of the group goes back to the early '80s. That was a big surprise. Yeah, I don't know how effective this group is really going to be. What are they, doing there? I don't, I didn't know exactly. They don't have. I doubt they have anything like the kind of reach that Hezbollah has. So they might, in the most likely, fighting, literally other Palestinians who are on the, Muslim Brotherhood alliance, so to speak.
Yeah, of course, inside Palestine, inside Gaza, they don't have the luxury of being able to kill each other. But on foreign battlefields, like in Syria, they do.
Yes, yes, exactly. And that's interesting because Hamas has stayed out of the latest melee happening in Gaza. There were those 250 bottle rockets that were launched into Israel, and then
Yeah, that was after the two strikes, and of course, Israel said the Iron Dome intercepted most of them, which I was kind of surprised by. The Iron Dome hasn't had a very good track record lately. But again, that's beside the point, and it's again one of these typical flare-ups. But again, as you mentioned, Hamas was not involved in this one. And I do think that's very telling, considering the fact Hamas's loyalties, of course, again with their positioning in the Syrian war, with their positioning in the broader Arab Muslim world, what camp they fall into in that. So I did think it's interesting the fact that they even declined to um, strike a common enemy such as Israel alongside a group that they might not necessarily align with on every issue. Probably very little issues they align on. I'm still surprised they sat this one out, but you can also link this to the fact that, of course, Israel propped up Hamas in the 80s as a more quote unquote reasonable party they can negotiate with. That they sort of allowed them to exist as a boogeyman, a controlled opposition sort of group. And yeah, and as far as I know, that they didn't actually strike any so-called Hamas targets in the past few days either.
hmm hmm yeah, I mean the Palestinians can't afford to get into a grudge match in in the tiny bits of land that they have left. So, unsurprisingly, yes, the Hamas stayed out of it.
Yeah, but that's all. That's all I have to say for that one. And again, it's something else. The fact that the first time Israel strikes a pro-Palestinian group in Syria, lo and behold, it's not. I mean, look, I would say out of not necessarily the Palestinian polity, the ruling government there with Abbas or whatever. I wouldn't say that Abbas has sort of stayed out of talking about the Syria conflict. I think he has bigger concerns in his immediate life and his immediate political career. But out of the pro-Palestinian groups that have been in Syria, I believe most of them have been anti-Assad.
Hmm. Yeah, and also just to put a little more context into this group, Iran condemned today the attacks by Israel in Syria and in Gaza with regards to this group, Islamic Jihad. Uh, they certainly found a name that it's, it's going to resonate. It's going to be very easy for Westerners to remember that name. I must say, um, but that just could be transliteration. So,
I mean, this just sounds like a group name that a really neocon early 2000s news outlet would have come up with just to
yeah,
scare the American public.
like if it's a jihad, it's already Islamic, anyways. Islamic jihad.
I didn't know we were going to get the Hindu jihad. Suppose you can,
Yeah,
like once you get them all together, do they just become like the jihad? Like you get all the world religions, they each have their own jihad group, and
yeah.
it's like the Captain Planet thing. They all put their rings together. Okay, I'm going too far with this. But moving on to a completely different part of the world, a little bit of news out of Bolivia. Might have heard about a little mishap in Bolivia. We can call it is the fact that their president since 2006, uh, Evo Morales, has resigned after months of on and off protests. After this recent bout of protests, he finally stepped down. Now, of course, I have no doubt that this glows in the dark. There is CIA involvement, no surprise. But I will say this: it happened so nonchalantly, it happened just so quickly. The exact opposite of what happened in Venezuela, I guess you could say. That I'm inclined to believe that. Look, I'm not going to say the CIA was completely involved. I'm inclined to believe that their involvement was minimal because of how competent of an operation it was.
Right. That's a good point.
And
Yeah.
also the fact that compared to Venezuela, the opposition is completely paused. It's Juan Guaido who has the transgender secretary in his party, and that's the reason why I should support him. A lot of the people I saw coming out of the Bolivian quote unquote revolution, whatever you want to call it, were again they tried to do this in Venezuela. Oh, they're far right Christian fundamentalists, but yet some of the leadership there saying some pretty based things. I do have to say now, not that I necessarily support them, but it seems just ever so more legitimate than what happened in Venezuela. Now, where I stand, whether it was legitimate or coup, I honestly don't know. And honestly, beyond the fact that another South American government got removed and will probably be replaced by another incompetent one, I don't think it's very newsworthy, but I think it's interesting insofar as the fact that it was the opposite of what happened in Venezuela.
Right. I mean, I don't particularly hold out much hope either way, no matter who's in charge there. I know, Salo, who goes by Fisted by Foucault now, was mentioning that one of the organizers for the coup is of partial Croatian descent. So these were Croatian fascists who went to Bolivia after World War II. So that's interesting. I know Bronze Age pervert is all gung ho about it. I'm personally not. I think this is still at the end of the day. This is still a CIA psyop, and people have tried to say that the white population is facing the white population in Bolivia is 5%, and they're in the upper brackets. And even that, even putting that aside, really, it's I don't see any kind of um, South American country achieving all that much. I mean, it's been ever since they've all had their revolutions in the 19th century. They've all been in this kind of state, anyways. Regardless whether they have a left wing or a right wing dictatorship. Um, I just felt that Morales was a better man than what they have to offer. But that's
Yeah.
my Nazgul
um,
talking.
I don't think Morales was as terrible as he was painted out. I don't think he was some fantastic leader who's going to lead Bolivia into some sort of greatness. But I will say this: I'm going to hold my tongue until I see what the actual new leadership has to offer. Because of course, there's been like just the shit posting like, oh wow, they're actual Christian fundamentalists now just paused liberals. Now again, I don't know how that's going to turn out. So far, they have an interim government with somebody who doesn't seem terrible, nothing great either. But at the end of the day, I just think it's interesting that I think it's interesting insofar as that it was just the mirror image of Venezuela, and that it just happened so fast as opposed to the absolute disaster their northern neighbors got. And yeah, again, it goes back to the fact when, of course, Spanish rule and subsequent 19th century regimes got removed. It's been chaos ever since. I mean, this may be an unpopular opinion, but I think Perón in Argentina was the last competent Latin American leader.
Uh, yeah, and it's not over for Bolivia right now. They still have to call elections. There's been a huge uh, turnout in their second most populated city El Alto. They were flying their Huipala flags, or is it Huipala flags? I don't know how to pronounce it. It's these multicolored checkered flags, and they've become like a symbol of the indigenous people of Chile. And Morales was the first indigenous person ever to be president of Bolivia, and he was the first to be president of that ancestry in Bolivia. So they still have elections coming up, and we'll see where things go. What exactly are the deals? I mean, I wish I knew more about Bolivia other than um, just the surface analysis that I've been looking at today and the last few days. Um, what do they really have to offer? I'm not so sure.
I mean, they're an oil producer, but I'd say they're an oil producer in the same vein Syria is an oil producer, enough to sustain themselves.
Yeah, yeah.
Uh, but I think that's all we have for Bolivia. So I'll move into the Spanish elections. Now these were something else. I'll pull up the official results here. Now these may be a bit hard to see, so I'll pull up the numbers myself so I can read them. But overall, especially compared to the election they had earlier this year, which is the fourth election in the row that was a snap election that wasn't actually supposed to be called, that where the government didn't fulfill its entire term, which you go through the history of Spanish democracy real quick. It's been a disaster. Universal male suffrage came about in the I believe 1856, around the mid 1800s. Um, that didn't work out too well. Of course, that goes into the crowned back dictatorship in the 20s, the Spanish Civil War in the 30s, Franco, the restoration of democracy to the point where uh, I don't. It's some ridiculous number. I don't think they've beat out Italy, but they've had some ridiculous number of elections since the restoration of democracy in 1977. Now, this is from Europe Elects from Sunday, with 99.8% of the vote counted, which, again, unless that 0.2% of the vote has something, just really, some really big game changer in there. As it stands, out of the 350 seats in the Spanish parliament, the Social Democratic Party, the PSOE, won 120 seats. The People's Party, which is the center right party, won 87. Vox, which is the more populist right party, 52. The hard left wing party, UP, 35. The Greens, 13. A Liberal Party, 10. Then, as it goes on, just bunch of smaller parties
Mm.
winning a bunch of other seats. Pro-independence party for Catalonia and these other secessionist regions in Spain. Which, funny enough, you actually look at it, as much as Catalonian independence may seem like it's just this cringe anarchist LARPers who are actually liberals. It's funny because if you eliminate them, if you just let Catalonia free, the Spanish parliament would likely be more right wing because it wouldn't split the vote. You wouldn't have those seats. But that's just an interesting tidbit I had there. But so far, nobody reached that majority to form a coalition. I don't even think the Social Democrats, who were leading a minority government after the center right leading minority government was overturned by, I believe, was overturned in a snap election. I don't even think the Social Democrats, the current ruling party, have enough to form a coalition, which leads us into another hung parliament, which led to the election earlier this year, which led to this election, which led to the past 4 elections this country has had.
Right, and both Podemos and the Socialists lost seats. It should be noted, right? The BBC is trying to frame this as socialists win amid far right surge, but like, yeah, I mean, they won. They barely won, and they have less power than they started with. Um, and this isn't some case of uh, they just lost a popular vote. They lost seats, and so I mean, I guess one wonders what kind of pressure is this going to put on the left in Spain. Uh, I am sure on some level they're worried. Um, and I do think that what's happening. I mean, I agree with you on the whole Catalan thing, but like, where is that going to go? Where is Spain going to go? Uh, I think even if you take the Catalan question out of it, and you can't, um, it seems like a place is deadlocked. It's ungovernable, and um, they've had a stagnant economy for quite some time now, and they've had to deal with migrants, um, even with terrorist attacks. Uh, and but I would argue that maybe the Catalan issue is still the number one issue for most Spaniards.
I will say this on that note. We could see, now that I don't want to go too far, but as a logical flow of events, this election may, as every Spanish election does, will increase calls for Catalan independence. We'll see like the movements there, them calling for another referendum, etc., which will in turn take your average Spaniard, take the Spanish people, push them further right, further towards anti-independence, because Catalonia with Barcelona, major contributor to the Spanish economy. So it's vital. So if they did lose them, they would take even more of an economic downturn than they have now. That pushes Spanish voters further right, away from the left, who are more sympathetic to the pro-independence groups. We
Mhm.
could see that Catalan nationalism may revive a form of Spanish nationalism. Now, I've also presented this theory that in the UK calls for Scottish or Northern Irish independence may do the same amongst the English Anglo population there. But I don't even know what to make of this because look, both the center right and the populist right, PP, and make your jokes now. The People's Party and Vox saw significant gains, whereas the Social Democrats saw slight losses. And again, I don't know how this is going to get solved. I mean, at this point, I know most European countries, most parliamentary systems, has a president that would come in and pick a ruling coalition. Now, I know Spain's a constitutional monarchy. I don't know if the king is just completely ceremonial or whether he has the authority to actually just come in and pick a ruling coalition. I mean, at this point, I think they'd be better off giving power back to the crown. I think it can't be any worse than what they have now. It can't be any more dysfunctional than what they had now. Unless if they go to this guy who's like, okay, you call yourself king, whatever, you're sort of just a ceremonial figurehead, and say, will you just please lead our country? Now he's young, he's a sharp looking guy. Now young relatively, I think he's like 48, 49, 50. I honestly think do a better job than most of the politicians in their joke political system.
Yeah, and you have to wonder about the the exclamation of Franco might not have actually helped Vox surge. Exhuming his body and making sure to keep it obscure and push the country ever into more of a secular socialism. Um, I think is also like the Catalan protests have I think angered and helped parties like Vox.
Now, I do think one of the most interesting developments out of all of this is you can see right here the CS party, which is the centrist liberal party, actually took the biggest hit in the election. They went down the um, furthest, which can look, not that the Social Democrats aren't as embedded in the establishment, the center right isn't embedded in the establishment, but I think it's interesting that their liberal aligned party, that's part of the liberal coalition in the European Parliament, took the biggest hit.
Yeah, they have even less power than they did in April as a result. And well, I guess we should also mention that Marine Le Pen and Salvini have congratulated the Vox Party. So that's caused the ire of BBC journalists and Guardian journalists and so on. They all have to disavow that this is a racist and fascist party and so on. I mean, honestly, these parties would have been considered left wing just 40, 50 years ago. So
Yeah, beyond the fact that they're sort of playing up the social conservatism to appeal. I mean, their economic policies are completely left wing. They're pro social democracy. They're pro welfare state. Now, the way they want to administer that welfare state is much more reasonable, as we've seen in countries like Hungary, like Poland. But beyond that, their economic policy is uh, they're pretty leftist on economics, and on social issues, it goes from anywhere like we're moderates, we're social liberal, to we're Christian traditionalists. Now, again, it's more of a the big appeal to them is the fact that they question the absolute power of Brussels. That's the only thing. Like you see this in some countries. I think Greece was one of them. Now, granted, the ruling coalition in Greece up until May of this year was an anti-establishment left-wing party. Now, they kissed the ring, but point being is they got elected on questioning the European Union, even though it was from a hard left perspective.
yeah, I mean, I think we should also look at Spain within the context of what's happening in the West, and that there is a kind of fracturing and disintegration occurring. Um, in the last 3 years, we're looking at whether they're left or right leaning. We're looking at several countries who, Britain is no exception with Scotland, who have territories that want to break away. Um, I don't think this is going to be something merely for a season, nor I think we've seen the worst of it. I think those days are coming for North America as well. Um, so these kind of gridlock politics, I think, are going to be the future. And that in itself is going to present a case for somebody that can overcome, um, because it will become impossible. Millennials, for instance, whether they're on the left or right, already prefer a more authoritarian approach to government in order to achieve results. So the institutions are breaking down. Um, and I don't see any other way around it. This process of fracturing because of gridlock, because of a loss of faith in like what the country or what the institution means, or in the EU, in the case of what the union means. It's we shouldn't think like it. I find it interesting, for instance, that Britain voting to exit the EU also simultaneously occurs with Scotland wanting to exit Britain. So this fracturing process is just going to continue, and I'm I'm fairly certain France and Germany are going to be fine, but I think countries like Spain and Portugal, who knows about Italy, Greece, and so on. Who knows? In the next 10, 15 years, we could see other sorts of things along this line developing.
Yeah, absolutely. And Spain is interesting because, again, as I've said, this is like their second election this year, but fourth snap election they've had. I think since 2017. So fourth election in 2 years,
That's
almost three
insane.
years. But
It's exhausting thinking about it.
it seems uniquely ungovernable as compared to countries like the UK. Even countries like Italy, which have had their fair share of elections, they managed to cobble together a coalition, albeit weak coalition, every time. I don't I don't see any possible coalition you could make out of all these bars I'm looking at on this screen right now. Not one.
Yeah, yeah.
But moving on from that, speaking of elections, we'll get into the British elections, more specifically Farage's strategy, which we touched on briefly last week. But Farage announced now, as we touched on last week, that he would only be running in certain districts. The Brexit Party would only be running candidates in certain districts. And he said he didn't want to threaten the Tory party. He didn't want to threaten the Conservative Party and Boris Johnson's chances. Didn't outright say that, but that's what it boiled down to. He wanted,
Mhm.
again, his thing at the end of the day is Brexit. He doesn't want to split the vote and put Labour in power. But he's running in what he calls marginally Labour districts. I guess they would be light red on the British electoral map, where you could get a Brexit candidate through. And of course, this leads to the British left saying, "Oh, he's colluding with the Conservative Party," which I think Farage, despite all the things I like about him, he seems a bit petulant to make a deal with the Conservative Party. He seems like a my way or the highway sort of guy. Hence the reason he formed a new party after he got kicked out of the leadership position. Now, granted, I think that was the right move in the end, but as we saw in Canada, forming your own party after you get kicked out of a leadership election doesn't always yield the best results.
Yeah,
Yeah, I'm pointing my finger at a certain Maxime Bernier, but that's beside the point.
yeah,
But
yeah.
again, it doesn't seem like it's in Farage's personality to broker a deal with somebody, especially like Boris Johnson. I don't see how those two type of figures could sit down and make this happen. Now, granted, I think they'll indirectly assist each other whether they admit to or not, or whether they even want to or not. But I do think it's actually a good strategy because he is putting his goal above his party, which I can admire that, and he's also running again where he has reasonable chances to win.
Yeah, I mean, from what I've read, liberals are concerned, and they have their, some have even espoused conspiracy theories about Johnson and Farage working together. We know who they really are, and so on. And overall, I think it's a pretty decent strategy. I think it would be. I mean, the Conservatives, yes, they've been a complete failure, but I don't think I don't think standing up against them right now is healthy because it still is in terms of mainstream politics in the UK, the only party that has that kind of prestige and power. And if it looks like there's going to be, let's say, a conflict, a quote unquote civil war on the right, um, that's not going to, create any kind of confidence for Brexiters. I think Nigel cooperating and focusing only on labor-held areas is actually a good strategy from the way it looks to me.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that, and it's probably one of the most sane things I've seen out of British politics in several years since at least the beginning of the decade. Now, I think this actually has a chance of working because when I hear most of these political strategies, I say it's got a snowball's chance in hell. But I don't think I have anything more to say about the UK beyond the fact that we're a month out from the election. By the time you hear this, we'll actually be like 28 days out from the election, I believe. Did they decide on the 12th? I think it was the 12th, not the 9th.
I think it was the 12th.
Yeah, yeah. So again,
Yeah.
that would put us 28 days by the time this airs. Now, continuing on the election trend, we also have none other than the good old Romania. Um, I don't know what I was going to go with there, but point being is this was a presidential election in Romania. Now, Romania being a parliamentary system, the president is a ceremonial figurehead whose only real political role is to form a coalition when a parliament can. For example, the same problem we were talking about in Spain, which, come to think of it, just not to backtrack too much, I wouldn't be surprised if we saw more calls for republicanism, so you could have this sort of system in place if that happens. Because again, like you can't exactly have the monarch do that, but that's aside the point. Now, Johannes, the current president, who's been there since I would say the beginning of the decade, since the early 2010s, won with 37.3% of the vote, and I believe that this is a plurality election and not a majority election. So he's got it first round because there only is one round. Of course, coming in second place was Dancila, who was part of the Social Democratic Party. Third place, Barna, who was part of a Liberal Party. Then Diaconu, who looks like he was an independent. And Paliogu, who was also part of a center-right party. Now, Ioannis, what I get from him is that he almost went the path of Orban, that he almost thumbed his nose at the European Union, but eventually kissed ring. Now, again, it's not like it would
Yeah.
have made much of a difference because his role is almost entirely ceremonial.
Right, and also there's been a huge turnout, the largest Romania has had of diaspora Romanians voting, mostly for him. So 4 million. That's a huge number of people to leave a country the size of Romania. They had 300,000 already on Sunday morning. Um, this is an odd, this is an odd country. I mean, it's in an odd position, but it's not unique. A lot of um, former Soviet bloc countries and even non-Soviet bloc countries have their people living elsewhere and voting for a country that has already had a brain drain. And you wonder, what are they voting for? What are their stakes? Presumably, most of them would have even less stakes in it than the people who are still living in Romania. And yet they're voting for policies that help them within the context of the EU, but damage Romania proper. That's that's a very strange mix. That's a very strange opposition.
Yeah, now,
Uh,
to my understanding, just to put more context to that, a lot of the people going out of Romania, particularly the Western Europe, you don't get many in the United States, you don't get many in Canada either. A lot of Romanian doctors go to France and Germany.
yeah, yeah, and I mean, a lot of Romanians of just about any field are leaving Romania. So yeah, I just think it's weird. The country, it doesn't really have that much autonomy, and then it has its own people to ensure it maintains a kind of relationship with the union. Um, but they're not willing to live in their country anymore. So how is anything really being addressed?
Yeah, and after Romania, of course, it's always been a nation, it's always been a people, but they've never formed a cohesive, I would say, idea of themselves as a nation. They've always sort of let themselves get rolled over, whether that be by the Ottomans, by the Austrians, Russians, various European powers, of course. Both world wars were either under the now World War One they were an ally. They were pretty much under the thumb of the Russians, the Allies powers, under the Axe powers under their thumb, of course, under the Soviet Union, Soviet bloc state. So they've never really had the chance to govern themselves. And now, as we see with the European Union, NATO, that doesn't look like it's going to happen anytime soon.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, I don't want to compare Romania to Bolivia. They are vastly different, but it's not. It's not at the moment a very influential country. It's not having an effect on on the greater whole the way Hungary and Italy and Poland are having.
Yeah, I mean, pretty much beyond its coastline, the Black Sea, and playing into a broader anti-Russia and/or anti-Turkey strategy on the U.S. and Western Europe's part. There's not that much they have to offer beyond. I mean, look, they have decent natural resources, but again, the impotence of the ruling class at home doesn't really give them much chance to extract them. Now, whether they got the European Union or not, and would that change? Who knows? I don't know enough
Mm.
about the situation to say for certain, but it is in one of those situations where, like you said, it's not really that significant despite major events happening there.
Yeah, yeah. So I don't like you could argue what would a right wing politician do and how would it improve the country? Um, you know, I'll say this for a lot of Eastern European countries. Um, coming from one myself, a lot of these leaders are experts at sort of toying with the public's emotions around patriotism and so on. And often the ones that are the most who appeal to the right wing are also the ones that like they will line the pockets of their political friends and achieve very little. And it takes something for people to rise out of that situation and find a leader that at least isn't as bad at that at least can accomplish something, right? Um, but it's ultimately it's something that requires a populace that's more united, that's more optimistic, in order to achieve something like that. Because of course that's where the leaders come from. I know with Macedonia, we've had right of center leaders that were closer in the closer alliance with the Russians and the Serbs, and but they squandered it. They did foolish and stupid things, and eventually turned the public enough against them with enough incompetency that they lost power. And I don't want to speak for Romania, but I'm willing to guess that there's a similar dynamic happening there as well.
Yeah, I would imagine. But you know what I think Eastern European countries need to do?
Mm.
They need to
What?
OD. Now, by OD, I don't mean overdose. I mean Oriental despotism. That's the only way out of this.
Hmm. I will. I just wanted to add as a counterbalance that the left in like southeastern Europe and the Balkans, they also do this. They like a lot of them were families of former communist rulers and so on, or extended families, like literally they're relatives.
Yeah, even
They're
in East Germany, that happens with their far left party.
right, and they'll do the same. I'm just saying for right wing parties that luxury isn't there, right? Because they don't have the support of Brussels, right? They can't afford to do the same thing. They have to accomplish something because the left of center um, politicians in these Balkan countries, believe it or not, I don't think that they're all that concerned about like what's actually happening to their country. They very much have they've settled in and have an approach not all that different from South American countries that are all happy to get rid of like a certain portion of their population out of their country. Now, that has enormous drawbacks. It's not quite like what's happening with South America. In Romania's case, you have doctors who are leaving, but presumably it's not just doctors that are all evacuating Romania. There's all sorts of people, and you know, Brussels and France and Germany are, and Sweden and so on are more than happy to like their governments. I mean, are more than happy to take them on. Right, and it like that becomes the main dynamic of how this country functions. It's what to do with the people you can't do anything for, or what to do for people that are aspiring for something greater that you can't provide. And so it's not a dynamic that's all that different than what happens with Central American countries and Mexico with relations to America. In some ways, it's not, of course, as drastic as that. I don't This is not, I admit, this is not a great comparison, but there is some overlap there.
Now, I think what you said perfectly segues into our last topic, which is Zelensky has done the impossible and sold all of Ukraine. I mean, he might as well have. With between the farmland, between the stuff happening with the banks, the gold, I mean, whatever. But this
Yeah,
new agricultural deal that they have with the European Union is, he might as well have just sold the country.
it's a disaster. And there have been protests, and there's a potential for a real powder keg to happen in Ukraine right now. One of the oligarchs, Kolomoisky, has like literally came out and said, maybe we're going to start working more with Russia. So they've already have begun this dialectic of going either with the West when it's advantageous or going with the East when it's advantageous, right? Um, I hope that's not just hot air coming from him, because of course he was instrumental in Maidan, and now that it's not maybe working out as well as he'd hoped, he's going to start supporting Russia. Um, it could also be a scare tactic. I don't think it's merely a scare tactic, though.
You know,
Although that does play a role. But this comes at the same time as the withdrawal from the front line of Donbass. There are still groups. Azov still has at least one or two areas that they're not refusing to withdraw from. Zelensky had to go over in person and still was unsuccessful. Protests have already begun in Kiev with pro and anti-Maidan. The anti-Maidan here is not going to be, I think, in any way vociferously pro-Russia, but they'll probably be accused of that. I think Ukraine is really at its wits' end right now. The economy has slumped for another year. Their contract with gas with Russia is up. Uh, they literally have to sell off their agricultural land, which is their number one prize, for the next billion from the IMF. So the IMF has essentially seized the majority of their land right now, and their farmers are in a panic. Uh, I do not rule out a kind of anti-West Maidan occurring in Ukraine in the next 2 years.
oh, I wouldn't at all. But
Yeah,
I do
go
think
ahead.
I do think it's interesting that you brought up Kolomoisky, because fun fact about him: up until earlier this year, he lived in Cleveland. He controls Cleveland real estate to this day.
That's right. He made huge gains back in 2014, 15, something like that.
Yeah. I mean, I think he's worth like $1 billion now. But yeah.
Yeah.
Point being is like these people. You could say they have no roots. You could say that they just sort of that they're internationalists. Uh,
You could. I wonder what kind of property he's buying and developing. I don't know.
yeah. He's sort of like at least from my experience. He's sort of an open secret. Everyone knows about him, but nobody talks about him.
Yeah, yeah. He's the famous Ukrainian Jewish billionaire who supported the Azov neo Nazis. What
All, all,
timeline is this?
all from the coasts of Lake Erie.
Yeah,
Ugh.
it's yeah. I'm sorry, but this timeline absolutely sucks compared to like classic Cold War era. This is just absolute garbage.
I mean,
So,
come to think, it's actually a very fitting sort of thing because you'll notice we remake a lot of movies from the 70s, 80s. We're just remaking history from the 70s, 80s, and like those movies, it's worse.
yeah.
It will never live up to the original. Look, Hollywood needs to learn that lesson. The politicians need to learn that lesson. You can't just keep on reliving. You just can't keep on living in the 80s. I'm sorry, it just doesn't
Yeah.
work. But
It,
I,
it's become so farcical.
I think that actually wraps things up pretty good. I think that ending rant really puts a bow on all this.
Yeah. If I could add just one thing, I think
Go on.
I just wanted to mention that I think Hong Kong is getting crazier, much crazier. It's getting far more violent, and today was the first day that Beijing and Hong Kong had called the protesters terrorists.
Oh wow.
There's been an evacuation of mainland Chinese students. Of course, one man was set on fire. Um, and some of the students actually went to a Chinese Liberation Army depot of some kind. And I don't know to do what, but the soldiers um, picked up the rifles. Apparently, that all the students had only heard them cocking their rifles, and they got out of there. But that's a that's still a bold move. That's still a very bold move. I think Hong Kong is going to get a lot crazier in 2020.
I agree, but there's one important question I have to put out there to
Mm.
judge the severity of the situation. Have there been pride flags spotted in Hong Kong yet?
Yes, they happen.
Okay, now it's serious.
And
We
Harry
we know it's
Potter.
going down.
And Harry Potter. This is Harry Potter, American flag, Union Jack, rainbow flag. Yeah, it's all there.
Okay, this is like DEFCON 1.
Yeah. But that's all I have to say.
That's all I have to say too. And well, what a show! What a show! We broke the obligatory hour 20 mark that these things seem to run to now. No problem with that. No problem with that. Of
Yeah,
course.
I don't have fun.
Yeah, I'm sure your shout out on a certain show last week helped that. That was actually a very good appearance. You should go check that out. What was the Slavosphere?
Yeah, the Slavosphere. Check it out. You can. He switched formats. So yeah, I'm trying to find it right now. Let me just give me a second.
Oh no problem. The clock's only ticking here. I've only had this ending. So, see, I botched that. This is what happens when the show goes on too long. But in all seriously, take your time.
Yeah, so yeah, I was on the show. That was a great conversation. Basically, we talk. I mean, it's for Slav Bros, but I think we're going to have Romanians and Hungarians on as well. Um,
Bridge those gaps. Okay.
yeah, so it's good. It's eventually going to become a kind of Eastern European bloc.
Any room for gypsies?
So the name on Twitter, it's Miesławist. I'm probably mispronouncing it. Slavosphere Pinecast.co. So check them out. It's spelled MiecZywslawslist, and the first L has a little slant through it, and it's wa, not la. So very old Slavic pronunciation. Anyhow, so he's on Twitter at AWSLIST, and he's been doing interviews on every single Slavic group, and we had a great conversation about Slavs and Macedonia and the EU and where things are headed and so on. So yeah,
It was very interesting. I recommend you check it out. It's got the War Report seal of approval. And
yep.
I think that
Thanks,
does it for
Paul.
this week. So see you guys next time, and goodbye.
Goodbye.